Good evening. Thank you so much for coming to our Advent mission. Tonight, we have with us Paul George. As a couple of quick notes, Paul has two of his three books with him tonight. One, Rethink Happiness. Monsignor's already bought 6 copies, so there might be a couple left. And then his other book, True Grit, which is about virtues for men. So if you have men in your life that you want to get a Christmas gift for them, here's a good one, and he'll be available to sign it after his talk in adoration. The run of show for tonight is Paul is going to talk, and then after his talk, we'll go immediately over to this side for adoration. So feel free. If we need some more chairs, we can just turn this back row, this last row, turn it towards us so that we can see as well. And then there's some seats also in here. So Paul, I've known Paul and known of Paul for almost 20 years. Is that right? So one of the first times I did a talk, Paul was the MC, and he was just as powerful then as he is now. Paul, at that time, was one of the members of the executive leadership team for Life Teen International. And then he left Life Teen and began to minister on his own. He currently is the president of the Art of Living, which is both a ministry and a consultancy. They do a lot of work with parishes and organizations to help them to function well so that they can further their mission in the kingdom. Paul is married. He has 5 children, and last week his youngest turned 6. So he is in the throes of child rearing and getting ready for Santa to come. And we'd like to welcome tonight to Paul George.
Thanks, Bernadette. Good evening. We do have a 6-year-old. Our house is interesting. So we have a 23, 21, 20, 16, and 6, right? So that's what our house is like right now. We only have 2 kids at home right now, a 16-year-old. So we're doing prom and kindergarten all in the same year. So we don't know how to do that. But great to be with you guys, and happy Advent. I don't know if it is happy or not for you. It's sort of a stressful, busy time. Advent is a lot about clarity. Jesus comes to give us clarity in our life. And just recently, I had something in my life that brought a lot of clarity to something that had been bothering me for years. It's a long story. I'll shorten it. But recently, I got asked to speak at a high school. One of my friends is the president of a high school, and he said, "Can you come speak to our students?" And I said, "Absolutely not." I said, "I'm old. I have kids older than the high school students that you have. My kids don't listen to me. Why would your kids listen to me?" I said, "I'm not doing it." He said, "Look, please, would you come? Our speaker canceled for Catholic Schools Week. Just do me a favor." So I said, "Okay, I'll do it." So I looked up some old talks for youth and tried to be relevant and cool, which I'm not. And I showed up at the school and I gave a talk. Now, there I shared a story about how I met the Pope, John Paul II. Now, I've met a lot of famous people in my life, all by accident. Not because I'm important, not because I've been asked to go to important meetings. I just stumbled in these weird situations in my life. So in 1993, I went to World Youth Day in Denver, Colorado. I got asked to go on a hiking trip, did not know that the Pope was going to be there, and got suckered into going on this trip with a group of friends, and John Paul II in 1993 showed up in Denver, Colorado for World Youth Day. Millions of people from all over the world showed up in Denver. There was mass with him and, all those things. So I'm there. I was baptized Catholic in the hospital. I almost died when I was born. My parents baptized me Catholic. I obviously survived. And then later on, they did a baptism in the church, which you cannot do 2 baptisms, but they did. And I always figured maybe I just needed it. So anyway, my parents divorced. We didn't really go to church much. And by the time I was, in high school, I kind of dabbled in it. And I was getting into college. I was like, there's something about the faith. And so, I got asked to go on this trip. And then they told me later, the Pope, and I was like, this is interesting. And this is way before the time where there was social media, internet, the things like that. And so you heard about the Pope, but you never really saw the Pope. You couldn't follow the Pope on Twitter or Instagram or look him up on the internet. Matter of fact, you just had a closet or a room about this big of encyclopedias. You guys remember those days? If you wanted to find out information, just come to my whole room of encyclopedias. And so you could look up Pope, right? And by the time you got that set of encyclopedias, that Pope was dead. And so you never really caught up on who was actually the Pope. So I'm going out there. Apparently, John Paul II is the Pope at the time. I didn't really know him. I never saw him. I never saw a Pope. I never heard about a Pope, nothing like that. So we're out there, and it's a cool event. Like, once the Pope shows up, he flies in a helicopter, he's on a stage, and we are miles away from him, and he just looks like a little Q-tip. And I was like, all right. And you could see him on the Jumbotrons, and, you're like, oh, that's great, that's kind of cool. And there were people from all over the world speaking different languages. Well, the great thing about John Paul II is that he decided that he was going to get off the stage and get in his Pope-mobile. And they made like little aisles for the Pope-mobile to go through because he wanted to be closer to the crowd because the crowd was so large. So they barricaded lanes and took the Pope-mobile and, started going through. And people were going nuts trying to touch him. It was like a rock concert, yelling in different languages. And I'm just surrounded by just people, okay? Now, I'm tall. I can see over. And I just got smushed into a very large group from Mexico, and they were all speaking Spanish. And there I was. I don't speak a lick of Spanish. I grew up in South Louisiana. We were forced to take French from the time we were born all the way through high school. I didn't learn a lick of French, and that didn't help me that day either. And so there I was, smushed in a group of people from Mexico, and the Pope's getting closer, and everybody, no lie, is freaking out. And I'm like, you guys, come on. Like, what's going on? Like, why are you freaking out? And they're yelling, "Viva la Popa!" And they're crying, and they're like reaching over the barricades, and like the Pope's getting closer, and they had taken the glass case off the Pope-mobile. And I kind of thought that was kind of cool that he, was reaching out, touching people's hands. And, I didn't know at the time that by 1993, John Paul II had been shot once and stabbed once in his papacy. And yet he was willing to kind of be unguarded and be close to everyone. And so he's going through, and people are just storming the barricades. There's security and people yelling different languages and nuts, and I'm just smushed, and it gets closer. And so there are people yelling, "Viva la Popa," and crying. I'm like, you guys, relax. Well, as he gets closer, my heart starts pounding. I get a little excited. So I just push them out of the way, and I start yelling, "Viva la Popa." And I don't even know what it means. I just know it means something important. They're crying. All of a sudden, I'm crying. And I reach out, because I have these long arms, the Pope touches my hand. And that's what I said. But as he touched my hand, this is 1993, he looks at me and he goes, and I was like, that's the weirdest look. Did the Pope just look at me like that? And he just kept going. And I looked at my hand, and I remember his face looking at me, and it's bothered me my whole life. Literally once a week I'll be driving and be like, I cannot believe the Pope looked at me like that. Like, what did I do? So I'm at this high school recently, and I'm giving this talk, and I'm sharing the story on how I met John Paul II. So I give the talk. It probably went horrible. The kids probably didn't listen. After the talk, this teacher comes up to me. She introduces herself, and she says, "Hey, I'm so-and-so." I said, "Oh, great." She goes, "I teach Spanish here at the school." I said, "Oh, that's awesome. Thanks for that." She goes, "When you were sharing that story about meeting the Pope?" I was like, "Yeah, I remember." She goes, when you were yelling at him, he looked at you like this?" She goes, "I know exactly why he looked at you like that. And I'm like, wow, okay, what do you got? She goes, well, when you were yelling at the Pope, Viva la Popa, you said, long live the potato. And she says, you called the Pope a potato. And she walked away. And I said, finally, I got clarity in my life. This is one of the best. I know exactly why I said yes to giving this talk at this snotty-nosed high school. God wanted to give me clarity after 20-something years. I called the Pope a potato. Advent. God wants to bring clarity to your life in the most simplest of all ways. Not in complication, not in chaos, in simplicity. You know, it's interesting where Advent falls for us. Advent is a new spiritual season for us as Catholics. It is the new year. Like if we were to say spiritually, when does the new year start? Spiritually, it starts with Advent. It's the new liturgical season. It's the new spiritual season. We all set, and maybe some of us do and some of us don't, well, we get to New Year's. On the calendar year, we're like, it's a new year, and we set these goals, and by February, we forgot about them, right? But really, the spiritual new year for all of us is Advent, the simple beginning of our spiritual life. And it happens every year because why? God knows that by the end of this year, we're tired. How many of you guys remember last Advent, what you did last Advent? Maybe not, maybe a little bit. But if I were to ask you this, how many of you guys are a little tired from the year? How many are a little overwhelmed? How many are experiencing a little bit of worry and anxiety and stress? And you know, it's interesting that Advent falls at this time that is literally the most stressful, busy time of our lives. And yet Jesus comes in the most simplest way to say, I can enter in to your chaos, to your worry, to your anxiety. You know, studies show today, and I am just as much a part of this, that people today, not just young people, middle-aged people and older people, more people today worry more, have more stress and anxiety than ever before. We are more busy, more connected than ever. Studies show that parents worry every day about their kids. Studies also show that adult parents of adult kids worry just as much for their adult kids as they did for their kids when their kids were small. Stress doesn't go away. Worry and fear, anxiety. That's where we all are. And that's where Advent falls. And that is the hope and the joy that we come around this Advent. Years ago, maybe about 20 years ago, I got invited on a mission trip to Honduras. And we flew into the capital city of Tegucigalpa. And we were in Tegucigalpa for, a week, 2 weeks doing mission work. And at one point, we got a meeting with the Cardinal of Honduras, Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez. And it's a long story on how we got that meeting, but I sort of got the meeting with him. And that's a long story how I got the meeting with him, but it was all by accident. But he calls and says, yo, come meet today. And so we dropped everything we did. We hopped in the car and we drove to his house, and he gladly met with a contingency of 5 of us. And on the way to his house, he said, have everyone prepare one question for the cardinal. And so I was thinking about the question that I was going to ask the cardinal. And so we arrive at his house. He was very gracious, welcomed us into his living room. And we sit around. And by the time everyone asked a question and he answered, he gave us about an hour meeting with the cardinal. It was the first and only meeting I've ever had with a cardinal, by the way. I'm last in line, and everybody goes around and asks their question. And it comes to me. And I'm pondering the whole time, like, what question do I ask? I get one question. So I don't know if you had a private meeting with the cardinal, what would you ask the cardinal? What question? And so this was the question I asked. I said, Cardinal, how can we help you better serve the poor of your country? Now, if you ever have been into the third world, right, your heart breaks for the poverty, for a lack of education, lack of clean water. When you're there, your heart is breaking for what you want to do and how you can help. And so I asked this question, Cardinal, how can we help you better serve the poor of your country? And he looks at me and he says, it's not the poor of my country that need the most help. He says, it's the wealthy. Now, if you go to Honduras, they're wealthy people. What's most interesting about the third world is the discrepancy between the rich and the poor. I mean, you can be right there in a road with someone riding a donkey to work, a donkey, next to someone who's got a brand new SUV, like no different than here. Like the discrepancy there is it's just so overwhelming. He says it's not the poor that need the most help, it's the wealthy. He says because the poor know that they need God, but the wealthy don't always think that they do. And he says the greatest poverty today is spiritual poverty. This idea that we can live life without God. And it hit me. It was probably the greatest class I ever took in my life, and it was one paragraph. It made me ponder, and it made me think, is that me? Do I live my life at times as though I don't need God? And yet, here's the reality that we all face in our lives, is that every one of us are spiritually broke. We cannot save ourselves. We can't. We can try. We can try to make life comfortable and easy and good. I mean, we come out of a pandemic wanting everything to be back the way it was, and yet we're still sort of experiencing what we've lost and what we can grab hold of. And if God fits in that picture, great. And if he doesn't, I don't really know. Maybe I forgot. But the reality is we all are spiritually broke and we cannot save ourselves. I can't save myself from my poverty, from my anxiety, from my worry, from my fear. Pope Benedict said this, the deepest poverty today is the inability to have joy. It is the tediousness of life considered absurd and contradictory, a life that feels overwhelming at times. This poverty is widespread today, he says, in very different forms. In the materially rich, as well as the poor countries, the greatest poverty is spiritual poverty. And that's the best news that we have. Because if we could save ourselves, we would be in trouble. I know I would. Where's your greatest poverty? I know it's sort of a weird question. What is your biggest need in your life and in your heart? Where do you struggle the most with worry and fear and anxiety, stress, being overwhelmed? Because here's the reality, is that our greatest meeting point with Jesus is not in our greatness. It's in our need. It's in our poverty. This is why Jesus comes very humbly and simply, not in grandeur, in Advent. This is the beauty that we experience in Advent, the simplicity that God so loved the world that he sent his only Son as an infant to save us. And I got to wrap my mind around that every Advent. It's a spiritual reset. It is a time to redo my life again spiritually. This is the beauty of the church. It doesn't say once you have a conversion or once you experience this, you're good for the rest of your life. The church knows that we're in this constant state of growing and learning and being in this process of conversion, understanding that our spiritual poverty is being always in need of Jesus. I was in confession yesterday, not to brag about going to confession. It's been a while since I've been. But I have a 6-year-old, and it was her birthday yesterday. She turned 6. And so my wife volunteered us old parents to serve lunch at school. So I did. Served lunch at school. And after I left, and I was walking in the parking lot, and there was the church on campus, and I was like, well, let me just hop in there. And I didn't realize that they were having adoration in there, so I was like, oh, this is great, adoration. And then I looked over, and there was, I was just like, I gotta go. Like God's just setting this up for me. So I get in line for confession, and then another confession line opens up. I was like, this is great. So I went into the shorter confession line, because that's what you do, right? You race to the shorter line. And so I raced to the shorter line, and this other man races with me, and he sits right next to me. We race together. He's about my age, no different than me, and we're sitting there, and he's got rosary beads, and he's rattling them in his hand. And he looks at me in the line. We're sitting in chairs in the line, and he just looks at me, and he goes, life's pretty tough, isn't it? I was like, yeah, actually. I said, what's going on? It's a very theological question, right? And he just started crying right there in the confession line. And he says, I'm going through a divorce. He says, it's the most painful time. The holidays are here. I have a little girl. He goes, have you ever been through a divorce? I said, well, my wife and I are still married, and she hasn't left me yet. I said, but I've been through 6 divorces with my parents. And he just started crying. He goes, it's hard, isn't it? I said, it's very hard. And I said, but you're in the right place. You're in the right line. And I don't have many sins, so I'll go before you, I'll rush, and then you can go in. He was going through something different than I am. But what he was feeling in the moment is no different than I feel. It's a sense of spiritual poverty. Like, God, I can't solve my life without you. I can't save myself from my thoughts and from my fears and from my worry. We all have that in common. Every one of us in this room. Years ago, I was meeting with this man who was actually having some marital problems, and his wife gave him an ultimatum to meet with someone, a counselor or a priest, and he says, well, I'm not going to a counselor because I don't need to be fixed. And I'm not going to a priest because he's going to tell me I need to go to confession. So I land somewhere in the middle. I guess he called me. He's like, will you meet with me? I was like, yeah, sure. And I didn't know what was going on, but he came in and I said, look, I'll meet with you weekly if you agree just to work on your marriage. I'm not a marriage counselor, but I'll hold you accountable for what we say in this room. And so he did. For about a year, we met weekly. And they worked it out and walked through some stuff. And, about a year later, I hadn't heard from him. It's fine. Everything was good. And he gave me a call, and I see his number on my phone. I'm like, oh, Lord, relapse. So I pick up the phone, and he says, hey, everything's good. I was like, oh, good. He says, but I got a favor to ask you. Would you mind meeting with a friend of mine? He's having a hard time. And I said, sure. Well, why don't you send me his number, and I'll meet with him, and I'll call him in the next couple of weeks, set something up. And he says, that's not going to work. I said, excuse me? He says, you need to call him today. I was like, okay. I said, well, send me his number. I'll call him this afternoon. He says, yeah, you can't do that. He says, you need to call him now. I was like, okay. So he texts me his number. I call this guy. I don't know who he is. On my way to work, and this guy answers the phone. He's voice kind of shaking. And I said, hey, I got your number. Set up a time to meet. Maybe we can meet in the next couple of weeks. He's like, that's not going to work. I was like, I didn't know I woke up today and everyone was going to tell me what to do. But apparently that's what my day is going to look like. And so I said, okay. He's like, can you meet today? I was like, well, how about this afternoon? He's like, that's not going to work. All right. He says, can you meet now? I said, well, in the back of my mind, I'm like, I got a full day, full calendar. Like, I get meetings. And I said, well, send me your, text me your address. He texts me his address. I'll map it. And it's like about a 45-minute drive. And I'm like, who is this guy, right? Like, what is he going through? What's going on? I'm not trained for this. Is he going to murder me, put me in a bag? Is this a setup? Like, all this is going through my mind. And so I call my wife and I tell her the situation and I was like, I don't know if I should go. She's like, well, you probably should go meet with him and just stop being a big baby. And I was like, but that's the theme today. People just telling me what to do. Usually it's just her telling me what to do. Now it's everybody else. So I was like, okay, well, look, if I die, here's the address. So I sent her the address. Come find me buried in some parking lot, And so I just show up at this guy's office. I walk in, receptionist greets me, and she's like, hey, we're expecting you. I was like, good. She shows me around. We go to his office. Look at his name on the door, his title, and so I was like, he runs this place. He owns this operation. Great, that's fine. So we walk in, shake hands, introduce. We sit down across from each other in his office. And I just looked at him like the guy in the confession line. I just said, what's going on? That's it. And he just started crying. He looked like me, about the same age as me. No different than me. Some of the things he was saying was no different than the things that I've thought or felt in my own life. But he had a long list of regrets, decisions that he made. And so I asked him, I said, what's the solution to all this pain that you're feeling in your life? And he says, I don't know. And he goes, but this past 2 weeks, I bought 8 cars. And he goes, I buy a car, I'd drive it for 2 days, and I'd feel the same way, so I'd go buy another one. And in 2 weeks' time, he bought a fleet of cars. I saw them. We did not have those cars in common. And he goes, that didn't help, and this didn't help. Have you ever just got on your knees before the Lord and just asked him to enter into your life, your pain, and your chaos? And he goes, the last time I ever prayed, I was in 2nd grade. He said, this is the last memory I ever had. He says, before my parents divorced. We never went to church. And I said, would you mind praying right now? And I said it as if I was going to lead the prayer. And he got on his knees in the middle of his office, and he begged God to come into his life. You see, the greatest poverty is spiritual poverty, and yet that is the greatest meeting point that we have with Jesus, is in our need. This is the beauty of Advent. We look at the manger in the churches, and we look at the scenes, and we think, oh, Jesus came so perfect into the world. And yet imagine the chaos that Jesus entered into. Imagine the logistics that had to fall into place for Mary and Joseph. Imagine the rewiring that Joseph had to go through to just say yes to this plan. Imagine the chaos and the traffic that happened once Joseph engaged in God's plan. In his greatest need, what? Joseph went to prayer at night saying, God, I can't do this, I'm out. And in his greatest prayer and greatest need, the angel showed up and spoke to him and said, here's my plan. And he woke up the next day and he loaded up his crew in a modern day minivan of a donkey, and they hit traffic and went to Bethlehem. Now, everybody was going back for the census. It was absolute chaos. The traffic. I have literally lost my faith in a minivan full of kids. And we often see the scene as like, oh, just them, and the stars are bright, and they're just floating down this dirt road on a nice, strong donkey, no one around, they're singing songs. It was chaos. People looking for family members, trying to figure out where they're from, roads crossing, and they finally make it to Bethlehem in the middle of the night, and there's not a single place to stay. And they find a manger, the most simplest of all places, the poorest, humblest. Why? Because it represents our very heart, where Jesus longs to reside in our life. And he's there. Jesus is born in absolute chaos. Herod's a dictator, murderer of kids, and Jesus is born in political turmoil. Does this all sound familiar? If we step back into that scene over 2,000 years ago, we would feel the same chaos and worry and stress that we feel today. Are we more bombarded by technology and the glamours of life? Maybe. But I can't imagine that Joseph's heart wasn't racing when he couldn't find a place for his wife to give birth. And yet that's where Jesus was born. Here's sort of the apex of the whole story. Jesus comes, and years before that, there was a major figure in Scripture that represented what was to come in Jesus. His name was Moses. If you know the story of Moses, is that Moses was born as an infant. Because the Israelites were being brought into slavery, Moses' mother wrapped him in a basket and led him into the reeds next to the river. Do you guys remember that story? You're like, oh, that's a cool story. Pharaoh's family, his daughter, finds the baby and brings Moses into Pharaoh's home. And the Pharaoh, the enemy, raises Moses in the home of Pharaoh. The very, very group that's enslaving the Israelites. Moses grows up, discovers his true identity of who he is. In private, God speaks to him, about setting his people free. And he's like, I can't do that. He's like, well, you got to. This is what you were born to do. So he does. He goes to the Pharaoh, asks the Pharaoh to let the Israelites free. Finally, the Pharaoh agrees to it. And there they go. They leave the land of Egypt and they head to the promised land. Finally, they're set free. Now we know the story. It says that they were heading the nearest route to the promised land, to the land of the Philistines, and God rerouted them to the Red Sea. Why? Because he knew that they would turn back and go back into slavery. There is no doubt that whatever you're facing in your life, the enemy wants you to be very comfortable living without Jesus in your life. He wants you to turn back and go to slavery because at times it feels so comfortable to be the same old person. And yet Jesus just wants to set us free. They were about to turn back. God reroutes them, parts the Red Sea, right? And as the Egyptians coming after them to bring them back into slavery, God closes the Red Sea, defeats the enemy. They wandered for 40 years. Hello? Looking for answers. And yet it says in Scripture that God never left him. A fire by night and a cloud by day. God's presence was with them. In just a moment, we will see God's presence. Why all this? Because Moses represents what was to come in Jesus. Jesus born into enemy land of sin. He grows up. You know what's the most amazing thing is that after Jesus is born, God speaks to Joseph and says, take your wife and your infant son and go to Egypt. And Jesus, as an infant, steps foot in Egypt to claim and do what Moses couldn't, which is to set us free forever. Every Advent, we're face to face with our Egypt. What does Jesus want to set you free from? What does he want to bring into your life of joy and hope and peace? Something that you can't bring on your own, manufacture on your own, because we can't save ourselves. I'll end with this. I have a friend that's a priest. He's older, and he's blind. Says Mass, does everything. But he can't see. And if you've ever met or had a friend who was blind, legally blind, never been able to see before or lost their sight, it's an interesting, they live an interesting life. And it's not that their other senses are better than us, but because they cannot see, they learn to use their senses in ways that we don't think about. Because as I'm talking, you can also read my lips. You can look around. You can see and hear all and smell all at the same time. And so if you couldn't see, you learn to use your senses in other ways. And so this priest is blind. He says Mass. And one morning, he's at the early morning Mass at his parish, 6 a.m. There's a few old people at that early Mass. It's a small parish. And usually after Mass, he does everything and then walks back to his rectory. He knows the route. He knows the thing, right? I have a friend who's blind, and he can walk through the neighborhood. He can walk home, walk to the grocery store. He knows the route. He's been trained. He can hear all the things, and he can function in a lot of ways. And so he's walking back to his house after Mass, and as he's walking back to his house, he hears a very large dog running towards him. He knows by the sounds, he knows the distance, and he hears the dog kind of running towards him, barking loud. you know. One of our friends that's blind, Bryce, he's never seen me before. We've talked, we've hung out, and one day I asked him, I said, Bryce, what do I look like? What do you imagine me to look like? He's like, you're 6'4". I was like, he goes, "You're probably, I don't know, 200 pounds, and you have a very big nose." I was like, you're spot on. So this priest is walking back home, and his dog's coming towards him. This is where it gets interesting, because he then gets turned around. And once you're disoriented and you're blind, then you really don't know which way to go. And that often happens in our own life. We just get a little disoriented, a little foggy, and we don't always know. And this is the beauty of the church saying, hey, it's Advent. Jesus is the most important thing. And it's not real complicated. He comes very simple to live in your heart. So this priest gets turned around, and the dog's getting closer. And so he says, just in the moment, he just prayed a prayer of desperation. So he says, Lord, what do you want me to do? And so he just felt like the Lord was like, just sit in the middle of the road. He's like, well, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. So he did a redo prayer. Have you ever done a redo prayer? I'm the only one. So he did a redo prayer, and when he's doing the redo prayer, he could feel a car coming and the dog coming, and he's really sort of in this predicament. And so he just says, Lord, what do you want me to do? And he just, like, the Lord was like, just sit in the middle of the road. He had no option, so he just sat down. He's sitting in the middle, the most vulnerable that he could be, in the middle of the road, blind, helpless, in poverty. So the car got there first, stopped right in front of him. He could feel like the air come off the car. And this woman gets out of the car, is like, Father, what are you doing? She helps him up, puts him in the car, drives him home just a few blocks away. He says he got home. He just sat in his chair, his heart racing. He says as he sat there trying to calm down, he just asked the Lord. He just says, Lord, what was that about? Why sit in the middle of the road? And he said very simply that he just felt the Lord say to him, I wanted you to be at a place where you could be found. And what if this Advent, you just made yourself a little bit vulnerable with Jesus and just find yourself in the manger with him? Just rest in the presence of Jesus, who simply comes to love us and set us free. What am I working on this Advent? It's a long list, but I hope that I have more joy and peace this Advent. That by Christmas, that I could sit in the manger with Mary and Joseph and just feel the peace of God in the midst of my chaotic life. And my prayer for all of us in this room is that as we approach Jesus and he approaches us tonight in adoration, that we too could find hope and joy in the midst of our chaotic life. Because Jesus comes in the midst of that, right in the middle, in the manger of our heart. So let's pray as we prepare our hearts for adoration. And Heavenly Father, we thank you and we praise you for this evening, for allowing us to gather here, for your great generosity, your humility, to send your Son to solve our greatest needs. And we pray tonight, Lord, as you just make yourself present to us in adoration, that we can just be at peace with you. We can rest, and that we could be at a place where we could be found. if we want to all move this direction for adoration, or you can turn your chairs or move to this other section. Monsignor is going to lead us.